So if you're watching, I'm just setting up. This bit will later be trimmed from the final video. Okay, let's publish that. Right. I'm actually going to kill the audio for a bit while I eat. So if you're waiting, I'm just running a wee bit late this morning, this afternoon. I'm having Maltesers for lunch. And I'm just waiting to see if someone joins me. See, Maltesers. All right, that's all my Maltesers. Now what I have for us is a Kit Kat. I do like Kit Kats. Probably shouldn't eat as many of them as I do, but you know, again, we're still on video that's going to be trimmed from the final video. So, and it did record that there was one person watching, so that's why I'm talking. Although I'm not sure there's anybody actually watching. But if there is, hi. And I expect Mark might join us in a bit, and possibly Sharita. And if not, I'll do a very short introduction to the module. I had to do stuff this morning, which I didn't plan on having to do, so I don't have slides ready or anything like that. But I do have something I can do, so. Just a minute or so before we start. Okay, looks like there's nobody's going to join us today. But I do want to introduce this module for those of you who are following by video. If you're following by video, I'm impressed, although you probably didn't keep up with the boatload of videos that came out over the weekend. I'm really sorry about that. I got behind and I really wanted to catch up. And it was also content I really wanted to cover because it's in the name of the course and all, you know. So I don't have slides for this introduction because I was too busy doing all the stuff from the previous module, but I do want to cover what I have in mind just by way of an introduction. And so we'll do that. Here's basically what I'm looking at. Well, first of all, I want to focus a little bit on the actual practice of creating artificial intelligence software systems. And so the module itself is titled The Decisions We Make. And the idea here is to look at what actually happens when people develop learning analytics or AI or machine learning, and what kind of, what decisions they make, rather than depending on some sort of intuitive idea of what the algorithm is or what the data is. Like, for example, when you say the data should not be biased, yeah, I'm going to agree with you on that. But what does that mean exactly? And the workflow that I have here from this website that I'll credit somewhere. I suppose I should credit it, actually. Let's credit it here. This is from a website called mlops.org, ml-ops. And it's titled An Overview of the End-to-End Machine Learning Workflow. And I got this site because I searched for it, because this is what I was looking for, right? So we have more details here. Now I'm going to share this link actually in the newsletter so you can read it for yourself. But now we have this machine learning engineering workflow. And, look at the different stages of an actual implementation of AI or analytics. So we've got out there in the world somewhere a data pipeline. There's a whole lot that could be said about that. Data pools, data lakes, data management systems, things like IBM's Cognos system. Anyhow, all the mechanisms for gathering data. And I think that a lot of the presumption is, well, that data should be unbiased where it originates, which sounds great, but is probably, for very practical reasons, impossible. But anyhow, we explore this data. So there is an exploration process that happens. You have to look at the data and see what you've got. And then what this diagram calls data wrangling or cleaning of the data. And you might think, well, no, we should use this data untarnished as it is. But what if they've misspelled the word Ottawa and put in only one T? Stuff like that. Or what about errors in classification? Or what about missing bits of data or data from two inconsistent sources? There are all kinds of ways data can be wrong and have to be cleaned. And then you have your data, and you're going to have data versioning, because you're not just going to leave it. You might get new data, you might get updates on existing data, etc. So once you have your data, first of all, you need to train your model. So you run your data through a neural network and you train it. What does that mean? Well, you've got the data running through this model. You can actually tweak the way the model learns, tweak the algorithms that affect the weights, the connection weights, tweak the algorithms that determine whether the one neuron passes a signal onto the next. That's known as the activation function. You can tweak the order of operations, like, for example, first do a clustering task, then do an association task. So we'll look at some of those. And then next, you need to test the model that you've created. Now, by model, what we mean is the specific set of neurons or units, whatever you want to call them, and the connections and weights between them. That's the model. It's not a model like you might think of a model where it's a representation like a diagram or whatever. The model is this connective structure. Now you need to evaluate this model. Probably you've generated several models in your work, so you might do a process of best model selection. And when you're testing your model, you need to be thinking about things like performance metrics. Is it accurate? Is it precise? Etc. Once you've tested your model, and you're going to go back and forth quite a bit, perhaps, to get the best model that you can, the best fit that you can with the data and with what you're trying to get your model to do, then you need to package your model and make it available for use by a third party. So there are various packaging formats, ONNX, JAR, PKL, and then you deliver your model as a finished product, which again needs to be versioned, because you don't just do it once and then stop. Any software is going to be iterated, improved, as you get new data, as you get new feedback, etc. So then you make the model available through a service, perhaps, or perhaps through a Docker container or Kubernetes, etc. So it goes out into the world, gets integrated with other software, for example, into a learning management system, or into a content recommendation system. So it's integrated with the code and deployed in production. But that's not the end, because now we want to see how that deployment works. So there's a monitoring and logging process to track how the model is performing based on actual data, and you bring back feedback from that. You go all the way back to your data wrangling and start over again based on that feedback. So when someone says we don't want the model to be biased, what do they mean, right? Are they talking about the data coming in? Are they talking about the data that's selected in the exploration and validation? Do they mean the cleaning process? What are biased cleaning processes? What are not biased cleaning processes, etc., all the way through, right? And we want to say more precisely, if we're going to talk about an ethics of AI, we're going to want to say more precisely, this kind of approach to gathering data is unbiased, or this kind of approach to cleaning data is unbiased. Simple example here. Suppose you have a big pile of data. What would the algorithm look like to make that data, change that data from being biased to unbiased? Well, there are some simple things. Take any individual row of data, right? That row of data might consist of, say, some individual demographic information and some responses to some questions, maybe a survey data, say. So now we've got a bunch of rows of data, and the individual demographic data can be looked at for a whole bunch of individual bits of data. And so you could look at that and say, okay, how many, oh, I don't know, I want to pick, how many blue dots are there and how many green dots are there? So there's a bunch of blue dots and a bunch of green dots. And you say, out there in the population, we have 70% blue dots and 30% green dots. But in our data, we have 90% blue dots and 10% green dots. So what we should do is either remove some of the data or weight the data so that the data also has 70% blue dots and 30% green dots. Well, what would the best process for that be? Do you remove some data? Let's say we decide to remove some of the blue dots. Well, on what basis do we select which blue dots to remove? Do we just do it randomly? That's one option. Or perhaps according to some characteristic, maybe we can look down and see if there's another feature of the population overrepresented. We can look at their ages, for example. And if one of the age demographics is overrepresented, we can select people of that age who are blue dots to remove. But maybe we want to keep all of the data because, if you keep pulling out, every time you pull out data, you're reducing the reliability of your sampling. So maybe it makes more sense instead to just weight each of the data rows differently. So you have 90 blue dots, 90 rows of blue dots, and 10 rows of green dots. So you multiply the blue dots by a factor of 7/9, and you multiply the green dots by a factor of 9/7, and that balances the weighting of each of these. And maybe, but you get the idea here, right? So it's not straightforward when we say, how do you unbias the data? So that's the kind of question that I want to be exploring in this particular module. Now, how does that work? Here we have now the, I'm just trying to share screen again. There we go. So here's the overall structure. And the way I'm going to do this is to look at how we approach these sorts of questions when we're talking about people. I just referred to surveys, but let's say we are the machine, right? We'll look at that just off the top to take into account some of these questions. Then we'll look at some of the more detailed information about how analytics works. We'll look at the elements of an analytics engine, go from the very simple processes to how these processes build up or accumulated to create an AI or machine learning model, and then talk a little bit about evaluating the analytics of that. And then we'll look at the decisions that we actually make as we go step by step through the process. There's the theory that we're thinking about, the objective that we're thinking about, all the data stuff that I just talked about, the different tools that are used, the model itself, something I didn't talk about in my quick overview, the interpretation of the model. The model produces results, but the results are just a bunch of dot, 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 dot. What does that mean in the real world? We need to be able to interpret the model, sometimes describing the causal factors, or perhaps being able to explain why the model came out the way it did. We'll talk a bit about the testing of these models, then the development of the applications themselves, how to look at the impact or outcome of these, and then finally look at the explanation of the overall system. Then we look at how we make these decisions in an ethical way. And I look at a variety of factors, including top-down approaches, bottom-up approaches. I know it's kind of blank there. The idea of human in the loop, which is talked about a lot, the idea of risk, and then we go back to requirements. Finally, who is it that determines what constitutes ethical or non-ethical processes in this analysis? And we've got a visitor, so I'm going to say hello to Jim Stouffer, and so we can see the rest of it here, and I'm going to stop sharing and say hello. So hello, Jim. Well, it may take a few seconds for Jim to come up, be up and running. And while he's doing that, I'll go back to the outline that I was sharing. Oh, no, here we go. Never mind. I'm just too impatient. I don't hear you at all. And that might be my fault. And I am broadcasting on YouTube. That's a good thing because I forgot to turn on my recording. Let's see here now. No, still not hearing it. This is almost certainly my fault, not your fault. La-dee-da-dee-da. Sound settings. Right, there we go. Headphones. Okay. Anything yet? Nope. All right.
No, I'm in. I had to tell it to join computer audio.
Okay, yeah, it does that. It's got that little gappy thing there. So
is it okay for me to jump in the middle? I just got done with another meeting and
absolutely. I don't know if you saw any of what I was talking about. I don't have anybody else in the meeting at this point. So I was just doing
just continue on and I'll listen. Okay. Apologies to all those watching the recording for my interruption.
So just to bring you up to speed in case you missed that, and it's okay, it's good to review for people. What I was doing is talking about my approach for this particular session, and basically looking at the workflow or the workflow process in actually working with artificial intelligence. So I quickly outlined this machine learning engineering workflow diagram, working with the data, wrangling the data, then using the data to test the model, and then deploying the model, and then using feedback from that to go back again to work with the data. So I looked at that in a little bit of detail, and then I provided an overview of what we'll be looking at in this module. First of all, how analytics works, going from elements of the analytics engine to how we evaluate it, to the decisions that we actually make at each step in this workflow. And as you can see on the left, there are a number of steps in the workflow that I want to look at, including especially things like interpretation, or what we think the data that we get, or the output of the data that we get, tells us. And then looking at how we actually govern the decision-making process in analytics and AI, what would constitute an ethical decision-making process. If, for example, we're thinking about how to clean the data, what is an ethical way of cleaning the data, and maybe what is an unethical way. But rather than talking about what would be ethical or unethical, what I'm interested, because we talked about that a lot already, what I want to talk about here is how we can go about making those decisions in the actual workflow process. So, is it a top-down approach? Is it a bottom-up approach? What's the importance of a human in the loop? How do we evaluate risk? How do we look at the requirements? And then finally, once we've looked at all of that, I frame these questions again under the heading of who speaks for us. Who are the people who are making the decisions about the decisions we make in the workflow? So there are different roles, like the data controller, researcher, the regulator or regulations, and it's not just GDPR, although things like GDPR are important, but as well, thinking of the population or society as a whole as more than just a source of data, right? More than just this raw material that will be mined and analyzed. So we look at things like citizen science, data analytics, and the role of the public or the wider population in scripting and design. And then finally, look at the social environment in which this is all happening. Are you familiar with Michael Wesch and his video, "The Machine is Using Us"? Oh, you're on mute.
Of course I am.
Yeah.
I've heard you talking about it in a previous video, but I haven't got around to watching it yet.
Yeah. Well, this is the place where we'll watch it.
Oh, okay.
It's I think it's like a half-hour video, so I'm just going to put it as a resource in the newsletter. But it's quite a good video, and it's very well done. And of course, it made him famous. But it really makes the point. And I think what's really interesting is that there's an overlap between the neural networks that are used in deep learning and social networks that are the subject of social network analysis, and then the wider network that is society as a whole. And I want to draw those parallels and draw out the ethical implications of how we do decisions in one as they relate to how we make decisions in others. I can't believe I just said do decisions. So, and looking at, the decisions that we all make as users in these social networks, because we're kind of like the individual neurons, right? And so raising questions like, do we actually prefer fake news? I know some of us do. Who do we actually choose to listen to? How do we do our own content filtering? Who makes the decisions about what we watch and what we listen to, which is obviously a relevant question in social media. And what are the new rules, if there are new rules, I think there are, about what matters, what's important, what we should be watching, what we should care about. And then finally, just to talk about the way we communicate as a society or as a network with objects. The stigmergy, as you probably know, is the use of objects as a signaling device. For example, the way ants might communicate with each other by moving grains of sand, building tunnels, perhaps even the pheromones, or etc. So I want to talk about that concept, and then talk about how we do that in real life, how we create actual physical networks as ways of governing ourselves in real life. And there's a really good, I'm going to mention this, really good website out there called Architectures of Control in Design. And it's all about how we use artifacts like, bumps on benches or spikes on windowsills, etc., to control the interaction and flow of people. And there's a whole science of that in marketing and store design. So that's the overall for the module that I have planned. Now, of course, I've just in the process of wrapping up the monster module on the duty of care. It seems unlikely that you would have watched the 10 hours or so.
No, I got through the part 2. Like there was a 2-part one. I got through the second part of that, and I thought, oh no, I'm going to join in today just to see what's going on. As you speak about those items, well, something that comes to mind. You were talking about citizen science, and then there was another one about co-designing the data collection or whatever.
Yeah,
it seems we have a duty of care would be to educate people so they can even understand what some of the implications are.
Sure.
To protect people from the popular misconceptions that get trotted out by malicious actors, bad actors who want to make money off of arousing people or want to destabilize society.
Yeah. I think you're right. But there's the duty of care leads us in that direction, but not unambiguously. Because, and this is something that I brought up a couple of times just in my overall discussion of it, a lot of the story about the duty of care is told by the people who have the power, the responsibility, who are the caregivers, if you will. And it's easy to say from that perspective, well, the process of citizen science, say, should be managed and organized in such and such a way as to make sure the right ethics are being followed. But here we have a case where the caregiver or the person in control is deciding what the right ethics are. But that's not really how the duty of care is intended to work, as I'm sure you gathered from those first two videos. It's supposed to be a genuine interaction between the caregiver and the care receiver, or whatever terms you want to use for them. I'm not completely consistent in my terms, but that's okay. And so applying the duty of care to questions of citizen science or co-designing research or things like that, the same sort of considerations apply. Right off the bat, what counts as citizen science and what doesn't? I think is a good question. We sort of sometimes think of citizen science as though it was, people going out and measuring things. And not so much, say, people getting together and having caucuses and teachings and then reporting back what their feelings are about such and such a subject. That wouldn't count as science. Right? But who decides that? And how are those decisions made? Especially when we think about how the citizen science process feeds into the larger mechanism of managing society and doing science. But you're right. Ultimately, duty of care does apply there. It's just we need to talk about that in detail. That's probably what characterizes this entire course is, oh yeah, they're right, but but even think, and this is hard because for me anyways, because I look at a lot of this stuff and the answers are so obvious and right. Like the whole fake news thing, right? I look at the news and I say, well, that piece of news is fake. People shouldn't listen to it and people shouldn't pass it on. the whole vaccine thing, for example, the anti-vaxxers, right? And I say things like it's morally irresponsible to pass on anti-vax information. But now, how do I get to make that kind of call?
Exactly.
Especially, like I'm not an expert in vaccines or anything like that. But then again, we say that, well, why would we leave it to only experts in vaccines to make that call? We wouldn't do that generally. I mean, like our dentist can make recommendations about treatment and they are an expert, but if you don't want to have a root canal, you don't have a root canal. That's the way it works. And there's no deep ethical issue about arguing against root canals. I have to take this. It's a security
Okay.
call. Hang on one moment, please. I'm sorry about that. That was really weird.
Are you getting flooded out?
No, I'm not. It's
Okay.
yeah, it was like a completely inaudible voice on the other end of the line. So I've been having that kind of day overall. So, but anyhow, yeah, the ethics of root canals never comes up.
Yeah, it's interesting how certain things get politicized. Like it's always more than just about vaccines or
Yeah,
those sorts of things. It's, but I mean, as we talk about, just thinking about people understanding ethical applications to AI. Well, we don't want this or we don't want that. And as you pointed out, we want to be very selective about where we do or don't want surveillance. We want to be very
yeah,
selective about where we do or don't want protection.
yeah,
And it's never as simple as populists try to make it.
yeah,
And so that's where I'm coming from.
yeah.
So expose myself to your knowledge and wisdom and the understanding and the depth and the nuance of this. I really appreciate it. And I haven't blogged anything for a long time on this, but you're talking about we need to know how to ask these questions because it just seems simple. Well, everybody knows what to do, don't they? That's, and just understanding that there's so much more depth to it. Where do we begin? We can't say, well, come and watch the however many hours this is going to be. How do I distill it down to colleagues in my Center for Teaching and Learning and then out to our faculty, so it gets to the students? That's my sphere of influence.
Yeah.
I have no control, but I have a sphere of influence. And, where do I take these things? That's my sort of where I keep going around and around on.
Yeah, and where it's going to end up, and this is module 8, is in our own practice, right? It's I don't think that any of us is in a position to be able to take the full ethical picture get that picture right, and then promote it to people. Just that's not going to happen. And even if that could happen, that probably wouldn't be desirable, even if it was the right ethics.
Yeah.
So what the actual practical thing is, I think, which is what I'll talk about in detail in Module 8, is how all of this manifests itself in our day-to-day practice. And so, by manifesting this in practice, by, each of us taking our own approach on how to interpret and how to apply what we've seen in this course to our day-to-day lives, that is what propagates the ideas. But in a distributed and non-authoritative or non-authoritarian sort of way. At least that's what I'll be saying. It could be argued out of it, perhaps. There's still time, but
I sometimes wonder what would I actually do if I had the authority, if I had all the power to do these things. And again, it gets to be one of those theoretical questions that, well, but I live in a certain situated reality, and that's where I have to work.
That's right. And that's true for all of us, right?
Yeah.
And, that's one of the really valuable things about the ethics of care, is that it says that, right?
Mm-hmm.
We can't just take some theoretical ethical position, no matter how well justified and rationally argued for, and say, well, that's what will govern me, because that always underdetermines what I need to do in an actual situation, because there's so many variables. Concrete situations are complex. You can't predict. And it's not surprising that that would be true with respect to the overall picture presented by this course, I would think. So I like that. I'm pretty comfortable with that. And I'm pretty comfortable with that as a finding for this course. But I think, part of the reason for the 10 hours of video in Module 6, etc., is that there's no quick and easy route to that realization. It's too easy to stop partway through and say, well, yeah, but if we did such and such, which takes us back to this module on the decisions we make in machine learning, right? Which is where a lot of people stop, right? They say, oh yeah, no, we recognize how complex and situated ethics is, but if we only just made sure our data was unbiased, then we'd be addressing the problem. Exactly. And I'm here to say, no.
By whose bias controls the decision of what bias is included?
Yeah. I was looking at, it was either yesterday or just today. There's this organization out there in the US, and it was looking at, trying to remember exactly what it was. It was looking at scientific abstracts and trying to make the argument that science in the US has become more politicized. That may or may not be true. I don't know. But the way they did it is they said, we're taking the following words and their derivatives: diversity, inclusion, equity, and then there's a list of about 5 or 6 more. And the presence of those words in the abstracts and in the papers indicate that the work is being politicized, and of course the absence does not. And so they do their calculation of scientific papers over time, and lo and behold, the incidence of words like inclusion, diversity, etc., increases over that time. Therefore, science is becoming politicized. So you could get your data exactly right in that, right?
It's
Um,
still, yeah,
you know, but the problem is, of course, that's how they define politicized.
yeah,
Um,
yeah. I mean, you start with a faulty premise, you can have everything else right, but your conclusion is still invalid.
yeah, yeah. The conclusion is ridiculous. In fact, based on that investigation, it would be foolish to say science has become more politicized. Um, but I mean, there's two things to say here, right? Um, there are other definitions of politicized whereby science might not be more politicized. That's the obvious thing. But the other thing is, suppose it's true that science has become more politicized. So what? We want science to be responsive to the needs of society, and society expresses itself through political means, more so recently. So maybe it's not bad that science has become more politicized. Um, or maybe we could say science, you can call it politicized, but these indicate that science has become more ethical, because these are all words, as we've seen in this course, that relate to ethics. And if you think of making something more ethical as political, okay,
Yeah.
but that's not a bad thing.
It depends on, just thinking about, the example you gave.
Mhm.
So I take science is becoming more politicized as a complaint.
Mhm.
That means the researcher is unhappy about the direction science is taking.
Yeah.
Finding evidence. Yeah. So, science is becoming more ethical. That could be, for one person,
Mhm.
that could be seen as a really good thing. Therefore, they'll find evidence to support what they like.
Yeah.
And for another person, EDI or DEI or whatever alphabet soup you apply to
Mhm.
equity, diversity, and inclusion is anathema to them, and they will do everything to
Yeah.
find faults with it.
Yeah.
And so,
And there's a basis for that argument in the ideal of science being purely rational and purely objective, which has been arguably the basis for its success over the last 200 years, right? When they've tried to politicize science in the past, for example, when the church said the sun is the center of the universe, period, end of story, or not the sun, the earth is the center of the universe, period, end of story, or that legislature in Minnesota that declared the value of pi to be 4.
I hadn't heard that one.
Yeah, that's a true story. Clearly bad results come out of that.
Yeah.
So, we see these debates in the news media as well, right? What is objective journalism? Do you want your journalism to be focused on diversity, equity, and inclusion? Now you're having a harder sell, right? Maybe you want your journalism to be talking about crime statistics and earthquakes, and maybe that's more important. Certainly you can do that in an objective way, until, of course, your journalism is nothing but crime statistics and earthquakes.
Yeah.
And so it's the urge to generalize on these points is just so pervasive. Every time, certainly, and I hit this every time I think, okay, I've got it now, out pops a generalization.
Yeah, I think that's understandable. Maybe cultural, that's the way we're given to think.
Yeah.
That we want, it's as part of our indoctrination as to fairness, that everything should apply to everybody the same way.
Yeah.
And we lose we're very successful at building bicycles and sending rockets to the moon, but we lose relationship with, I mean, the whole conversation around sustainability now is another really polarizing factor
Yeah.
that illustrates that science is not entirely objective.
Yeah. Yeah. But on the other side of that is people taking advantage of the fact that science is not entirely objective to muddy the waters and obscure some of the things that science tells us, like there is
Yeah.
global warming.
Yeah. And so, getting back to this whole thing about, ethics applied to AI,
Mhm.
we have to have a certain amount of understanding before any of that makes sense.
Yeah. And that's, it's not like there's nothing to say about the ethics of AI. It's just that a big part of it, and this is actually the approach that I've taken more generally, is that we need to rethink what we mean or what we have when we have a generalization. And I, in my own mind, I just reinterpret pretty much any generalization that I come up with as an instance of pattern recognition. And so it's like, it's really no different than going, oh, a dog, oh, a pattern, oh, a generalization, and just because I see a pattern doesn't mean I found some deep truth about reality, but I've got something that maybe I can work with that will help me. And I think that's the better approach to take. And it certainly allows for my patterns, my generalizations, to always be possibly wrong, and things like that, or to not apply in a certain circumstance, or even better, it allows me to have mutually contradictory generalizations, because there are situations when either or the other, or even both, might actually be true at the same time. And we expect science to present this one big consistent picture of the universe, but consistency is this ideal rationalist notion that we have, that comes to us prior to any experience, and not sure that can be what governs us, my thinking anyways.
Well, we have to make ourselves deliberately blind to experience in order to maintain that, to get rid of that cognitive dissonance. That's what often happens. I mean, I'm just, so much of what you're relating I see happening in religion as well. And just recognizing the nuance, and like you said, holding that with the idea that I might be wrong, is something that religion does not care to do. It's too much at stake. And so approaching it with that kind of humility is, I think, really an important way forward.
I keep getting reminded of that argument that Bill Nye had with someone. I forget what his name was, because I know about Bill Nye and I don't know about the other guy. But it came down to Bill Nye asking him, what would make you change your mind on this? And the religious guy said, nothing at all would make me change my mind. And I said, well, that's the difference between you and me. Evidence would change my mind. New experiences would change my mind. New facts would change my mind. And I sometimes want to go back to the people who are religious and say, well, just to get a foot in the door, right? What if God came to you and said, you're wrong about this? Would you change your mind? And I think that's an interesting question, because it seems so unreasonable to not be willing to change your mind about anything ever, no matter what. So you find the point where you've identified something that would change your mind, and then maybe you have a basis to work from. Maybe not, but that's where I would start, I think.
Yeah. Yeah, that's lots to think about.
Yeah. I mean, I don't think you can actually argue with people that way.
Well, this is what I'm thinking, I mean, just taking the resistance to COVID vaccine.
Mhm.
There is no amount of evidence that will change somebody's mind.
Yeah.
I've seen a case where a personal
Yeah.
experience made somebody say, maybe it wasn't such a good idea.
Mhm.
But more facts, they're not making decisions on a rational basis. So approaching it from a rational,
Exactly. Yeah.
rational argument is not going to do it. It's
Yeah.
um,
And I mean, there's a more general statement to be made there about the approach people take about a lot of these issues. I think of like Creative Commons, for example. This is a totally unrelated subject, right? But Creative Commons is very interested in promoting open resource sharing. But they see a big part of what they're doing as being based in policy and advocacy, right? So, in other words, arguing for open sharing. They're not going to win. They're not going to lose. It's just an awful lot of effort being spent to argue in a world where argument doesn't work.
Okay.
I've tried to argue with them about that, but they won't listen to me.
I'm not that deeply into it. I just like getting free stuff, and I've started, putting that on wherever I can if I do produce anything.
Yeah.
But the policies and that behind it are a level that I haven't delved into. But I did see you wear the Creative Commons shirt in a few videos.
Yeah. Well, there again, right? I'm not, the whole idea is, I'm not making an argument for Creative Commons, but I'm wearing the CC shirt. That's one thing. So, but also, all of the resources in this course are OERs. They're licensed through Creative Commons and all of that. And I'm very open with all the practice, right? So instead of arguing with someone about this, I'm showing what can be done. I actually produce an instance in practice of OER in action.
Yeah.
So, and I think that's the only way to do ethics.
To demonstrate it.
And then the question is, okay, well, how do you do that? How do you go about that? But you need to see.
And also, even when we demonstrate it, have the humility to someone is having difficulty with it, saying, okay, what's your situation?
Yeah. Oh, you froze halfway through the situation.
Just have the humility to say, your situation may well be different from mine.
Yeah. Agreed. Exactly.
Just at the risk of extending this, I'm thinking about the issue of surveillance that came up when everybody went online, and I spent time that day watching the teaching against surveillance, and really great, and then began to realize, though, that there were students who were benefiting from having the classes recorded.
Yeah.
And so it wasn't just as simple a thing as do not record.
Yeah. Obviously, you think of all the people who can't get to class, even when there's no pandemic.
Yeah.
Their cat died or whatever, right?
Yeah.
I sure could have used it when I was a student, because my attendance rate was abysmal. But I mean, that's. It's not
an
100.
illustration of, there's something that has a big appeal, but then you start realizing, okay, it's more nuanced. So it doesn't invalidate what they
Yeah.
said, but it is going to impact how you're going to apply it.
Yeah. And even more broadly, we look at the revelations that people like Chelsea Manning, Edward Snowden, and Julian Assange made with the Panama Papers and the revelations about torture and Abu Ghraib and all of that. And you think, well, it's a good thing somebody was watching, because here we have, massive global crime and corruption. Maybe surveillance is necessary. And so, it's not just yes surveillance or no surveillance. That's, I was reading about John Perry Barlow's Declaration of the Independence of Cyberspace, which is, I don't know, 25 years old now, and comes from obviously a libertarian perspective. But the essential argument that he makes is that we who are in cyberspace are living in this world of the mind, and we don't need any regulation at all from government. Fast forward 25 years, after 25 years in which cyberspace has been essentially unregulated, there's some regulation around the edges, and it is by all accounts a cesspool. I was looking at the news this morning, and it's like, society versus technology company, society versus technology company. Just run down through the news, right? Society versus technology company. And that's not really what people had in mind when all of this was originally being created. And the reason why that happens is, at least in part, because of the lack of oversight and regulation over cyberspace. It's, if what we got was a government in cyberspace about as effective as the government of Somalia. And big surprise, we got a similar result. At least I could argue. So again, a simple, unnuanced, non-situated generalization fails. I know I sound like a broken record player.
No, but I think it's something that we need to keep saying, and I need to keep hearing.
Mm-hmm. Anything else before we wrap up with this session?
No, that's good. I'll go back and watch some more videos.
Okay, well, I hope you're enjoying it.
I am.
Oh,
I just wish I had more time to engage with it, but I am thoroughly enjoying it. And
good. Well,
glad I get to get into a live session and once in a while.
Yeah. Well, you're always welcome, of course, and especially today when there was no one else. But like I said at the start of the course, I'm ready to continue delivering this course, even if there's nobody out there, because it's all stuff I think that needs to be said.
It is, and thank you.
Okay, well, thanks for joining me. And
Okay.
For those watching, our next live session will be on Friday, the 4th? No. The 3rd of December, 12 noon Eastern Standard Time, and we'll be wrapping up the module that we introduced here on the decisions we make when we're doing AI and analytics. Jim, nice to talk to you.
Bye then.